Chesapeake Bay was formed around 12,000 years ago and is approximately 200 miles long, bordering 6 states. The Chesapeake Bay is home to a plethora of aquatic life, plants, and waterfowl. More than 350 species of fish and crustaceans live all over the bay. There are also thousands of species of plants that grow all the way from the very bottom of the bay all the way up to the shallows. These plants are a vital food source for the creatures that live in and around the bay. The bay is not only heavily populated in the summer and spring, but also is very important in the winter. Millions of waterfowl migrate to the bay in the winter and make it their home for the season. For that reason, keeping the bay clean is crucial to being a sustainable habitat for all these animals to survive. Nitrogen and phosphorus are the two main components to polluting the Chesapeake Bay. The problem with having high levels of nitrogen and phosphorus is that they create what are called algae blooms. Algae blooms occur when there are excessive amounts of nitrogen or phosphorus in the water, combined with warm weather. Algae starts growing in the water when it encounters sunlight, which then spreads all over the bay due to the currents and tides. These algae blooms are super harmful to the ecosystem because not only do they carry bad chemicals and nutrients, but they block all the sunlight trying to get to the bottom of the bay. This then leads to what are called dead zones. Dead zones are when there is a lack of oxygen in the water. A lack of oxygen in the water means that no plants, crustaceans, fish, or oysters can live there. This essentially deletes part of the bay and makes it toxic to anyone swimming in it. Leads me to my first solution, which is planting oysters in the bay. Oysters are essential for keeping the health of the bay maintained. One singular oyster can filter up to 50 gallons of water a day. This is insanely important because they filter minerals and nutrients like nitrogen and phosphorus. To the bay, these nutrients are super harmful and end up killing the ecosystem. But to oysters, these nutrients are very important to consume because they are its source of food. This brings me to my first part of my solution, which is having everyone in your community that lives on the water start planting oysters at their docks or marinas. This will start building up the number of oysters in the community, which we will then be able to plant on either dead oyster beds or oyster beds that are barely staying alive. Starting a petition to have everyone that owns a dock or a slip in a marina to grow oysters will also help immensely to start reviving the oyster beds in our bay. Once we get everyone to start growing oysters, then we can worry about where to plant them. We can either start making new oyster reefs at the foot of your docks or marinas, or we can start planting them at dead oyster beds or oyster beds that are barely still hanging on. Doing this will start creating giant filters in the bay that filter out any bad nutrients, chemicals, or anything bad that is hurting the bay. Not only do these oyster beds create big filters in the bay, they also create very good homes for small animals and big animals to feed on. The second solution is to reduce the amount of runoff water. A new design will reduce the runoff water coming mainly from the streets of cities and neighborhoods that back up to the bay. This design will be called bay catchers. These will filter out all of the nitrogen and phosphorus and anything else that is being carried into the water. These bay catchers will be implemented at the end of every street that runs into the water around the bay. The design is sort of like a barrier for the streets and like a rain catcher that we will put under every grate that leads into the sewer. This design will be made of steel so it doesn't rust, soil, which will absorb some water and most of the nutrients, and layers of very fine mesh that will catch any additional nutrients, trash, grass, or sediment. It'll also have filters that filter out the nitrogen and phosphorus. First up will be the mesh layers, which will be on top to stop any trash, sticks, grass, or sediment that flows in. Next will be the nitrogen and phosphorus filters that will catch the majority of these elements. Lastly, there will be a 6-inch layer of soil which will catch any additional nutrients and filter them out before the water reaches the sewer, which will then lead into the bay. Now, I know that these filters won't filter out all of the nitrogen and phosphorus and bad chemicals going into the bay, but Being able to reduce the amount of nitrogen and phosphorus that are getting washed into the bay by runoff water will help immensely. My third and final solution also ties into stopping the amount of nitrogen and phosphorus entering the water through runoff water. Another major way these nutrients enter the water is through water treatment plants. There are a total of 472 running wastewater treatment plants right now on the Chesapeake Bay. Every day they treat the sewer water, which is then clean enough to send into the bay. But until recently, they weren't looking to filter out any nutrients like nitrogen and phosphorus. And this is thanks to the Chesapeake Bay program, which started doing tests that figured out how high the levels of nitrogen and phosphorus there were in the treated water that they were sending into the bay. They started to implement a law called the flush tax, which made all these plants filter out the majority of phosphorus and nitrogen that the untreated water was carrying. This ended up being super successful according to the Chesapeake Bay program, but it wasn't filtering out all of the nitrogen and phosphorus that was going into the water. My solution is to reroute where the water is going. Therefore, we are going to reroute the water coming from the water treatment plants over to farms and forests where they need these nutrients to start growing trees and plants. This will benefit us in two ways. One being these nutrients will not enter and harm the bay. And two, these nutrients will help the crops and trees grow naturally, which means that there will be less fertilizer being used on these farms. Another way this is huge is that once we grow more trees and make more farms and forests denser due to these nutrients, they will then be able to absorb more rainwater, which also carries nitrogen and phosphorus in it. This is only a start to restoring the Chesapeake Bay, but a very big start and will help the bay a lot. The problems discussed are not the only problems out there in terms of polluting the bay, but they are the main ones. Some other ways the bay is being polluted include air pollution, littering, invasive species, overfishing, and overpopulation. The list goes on with the ways the bay is being polluted, and hopefully one day it'll change the way people live and become more eco-friendly.